all for joining us tonight. My name is Michael Constance, Associate Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge. Do I have to project a little bit? I'm Michael Constance, Associate Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge here at NYU. Tonight's event with Chelsea Ebin and Joe Lowndes is sponsored by our working group on global right, which is a great group that's been here at IPK since 2019.
Could you explain briefly what public knowledge is? What the purpose of this institute?
I would briefly do it, and I can explain to you in greater detail after the event. So essentially, IPK, which has been here since 2007, falls under the Office of the Provost, aims to link academic research to the broader public. It's an interdisciplinary institute. The core is sociology, but we're made up of sociologists, historians, journalists, psychologists, you name it. Anyone who's interested in linking academic research to the public. I'd be happy to explain that in a little bit more detailed way after the event. Yes. But tonight, we're very happy to have Chelsea Ebin, author of this book right here, The Radical Mind, Origins of Right-Wing Catholic and Partisan Coalition Building, which was published in 2024 by the University of Kansas Press. You are more than welcome to buy a copy of Chelsea's book using the promotional flyer that should be on your receipt with a discount code below. Aside from being the author of this book, Chelsea is an assistant professor of political science and international relations at Yale University and co-editor of Male Supremacism in the United States, from Patriarchal Traditionalism to Misogynist Incels and Male Supremacism. She is co-founder of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism and a fellow at the Far Right Analysis Network. Here to comment on Chelsea's work is Joe Lowndes. Joe is, as many of you may know, is a scholar of U.S. politics at Hunter College, where he's also the director of the public policy program at the college's HoSang house. His research focuses on right-wing politics, populism, and race. He's the author of From the New Deal to the New Right, Race and Southern Origins of Modern Conservatism, and co-author with David Martinez the same book, Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. Along with his scholarly work, he's frequently published in public venues, including the Washington Post and the Public Protestant. He's currently co-editing a volume entitled Politics of Multiracial Right, and he's at work on another book, Adventures in Post-Democracy, which seeks to explain the growing authoritarian trend in political culture. You've heard about that through a chronicle of his ethnographic work in right-wing spaces over the last decade. So, Joe, thank you for being here. Chelsea, thank you. You have the floor. Joe and Chelsea will have a conversation for an hour or so. We'll make sure to save about 25 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please welcome Chelsea Ebin. I don't know if we can do that.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I want to no idea how to explain this, actually, but I would really like to. And the broader context for it is, as the George W. Bush administration was winding down and we were ramping up into the Obama years, there were really confusing things happening on the Christian right. David Kirkpatrick wrote an article for the New York Times titled The Evangelical Crack-Up, and there was this sort of widespread perception that the Christian right was done. It was over, we didn't need to worry about it anymore. At the same time, we were also seeing a sort of growth in the prominence of Catholic intellectuals in the legal sphere. So notably, Robert P. George was proclaimed the conservative Christian big thinker by the New York Times. And they really interestingly omitted from the title that he is a conservative Catholic. And all of this got me thinking about what the role of conservative Catholics was in the Christian right. Because it seemed that maybe they were working together much more closely than anyone was paying attention to. And I wanted to understand this in large part because we have this long history of antipathy between Protestants and Catholics in this country. And, it dates back to the 17th and 18th century when Protestant settlers disliked and distrusted Catholics. They were very much regarded as others and unwelcome immigrants, and were also racialized lower on the hierarchy than were white Protestants. Now, this sort of anti-Catholic trend continues up through the 1960s when JFK runs for president, and we get documents like this. These are on either side are pamphlets from the archives. One says, "Protestants in a spiritual stupor breathe strong Roman Catholicism." The other warns that if JFK is elected, we will have the Pope for president. The little tiny one in the middle has the Roman octopus, and the Pope is depicted as an octopus swallowing the world. So what I set out to answer was how we get from here in 1960 to here in roughly 34 years, right? And this second year is First Things, which is an ecumenical Christian publication that was created by Richard Newhouse, who was a Lutheran pastor who converted to Catholicism. Published in '94, this statement, "Evangelicals and Catholics Together, the Christian Mission in the Third Millennium," vowing to work together in common cause and to set aside their history of sort of contention with one another. So if we jump even further ahead, we could also ask how we get here, which is J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, sharing a stage with Pastor Jason Howard at an event hosted by Lance Wallnau, who's a leader of the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a Christian supremacist and theocratic Protestant movement. Right? This would have been unimaginable 60 years ago for a Catholic to be on stage with really what is the sort of newest iteration of Christian Reconstructionism or Protestant Reconstructionism. So to try and answer this, I went digging around in the archives. And I started with this sort of common knowledge for historians and political scientists who study the Christian right, that Paul Weyrich had claimed that he had sort of initiated the Christian Right Coalition. And Weyrich was the sort of political entrepreneur par excellence of the New Right, which was ostensibly a secular movement that formed in the early 1970s to push a self-proclaimed radical conservative agenda. And I thought to myself, okay, well, Weyrich says that he was there at the inception, so I should go see what Weyrich has to say. I'm sure I'll find, something about Catholics here. And what I found was that Weyrich and his crew were the Catholics. And somehow that just hadn't been really widely remarked on. It turned out that the Paul Weyrich scrapbooks, which had just been cataloged and made available to researchers at the Library of Congress, were chock-a-block full of Weyrich's deep Catholicism and commitment to advancing a Catholic worldview. So in large part, the book is the sort of happy accident of having gotten to the archive before anyone else did, or rather at the very beginning of its availability. And this led me to really begin to focus on the role of the Catholic New Right, and then the Protestant, fundamentalist, and evangelical Christian right, really spearheaded by Jerry Falwell, who's the founder of the Moral Majority, and to look at how they come together to form the new Christian right. Now, here we have Weyrich, and we also have Connie Marshner, who's a lesser known but equally central architect of the new right. And I've made it my personal mission to have everyone know that she claimed responsibility for successfully lobbying Nixon to veto universal child care, not once, but twice. And if you think about what a different economic and social world we might have if we had 50 years of universal child care, her influence really cannot be overstated. Now, Weyrich was really open about what he was doing. So I have here a quote from him where he stated that breaking the barriers between evangelical leaders and Catholics was key. There were years of anti-Catholic feeling in the fundamentalist community, but I had more in common with some in terms of belief in the Lord and fundamentals of the faith than I did with some liberal Catholics. I worked on Catholics to support evangelical candidates and evangelicals to support Catholic candidates. Now, if you think I'm overstating this, I have another quote from Weyrich where he's talking about Jerry Falwell, and he says that looking toward the press table, Falwell said it all. The media had better understand that in another context we would be shedding blood, but our commitment to the family has brought those of us of differing religious views and backgrounds together to fight a just cause, to fight for the family. Right, so they were very self-aware and intentional about the coalition that they were brokering, and recognized that it was unprecedented in many ways. So the question for me became, how did they form a coalition, right? What were they actually doing? What were the nuts and bolts of it? And there's a common narrative that the Christian right emerged fully formed at the end of the 1970s. It's like Athena, sprouting from Zeus's head, fully formed. The Christian right just emerged. And it did so because it was motivated by the backlash to progressive gains made by the civil rights movement, women's rights, and gay rights movements. I found neither of these things to be true. Instead, what I found was that the coalition between conservative Catholics and Protestants was made possible by institutional changes within these groups' respective faith traditions, parallel institution-building developments, and the creation of a pro-family platform, where you can see Falwell, right, saying that he is ready to fight for it. And that it was decidedly a forward-looking and proactive movement. It was not backlash-driven. It was not trying to return us to the past. So in the book, I detail how they built this coalition by looking at how they capitalized on changes within their respective religious traditions and communities to build points of convergence. So chapter 2 really focuses on the Second Vatican Council and how that created an opportunity for a hyphenated Catholic identity to emerge, right? So suddenly you could have conservative Catholics or right-wing Catholics instead of a sort of universal Catholic identity. And it also empowered the laity to take action in social and political affairs. Now, much of that action was motivated by their resistance and hostility to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, but they didn't really seem bothered by that, right? Happy to take advantage of the opportunities while also lambasting it. And on the conservative Protestant side, there were also sort of internal transformations occurring within the faith community, particularly to break down barriers of isolation for fundamentalist Protestants, and to embrace a strategy of what the fundamentalist theologian Francis Schaeffer called co-belligerency, to recognize that you can work with members of other denominations in service of a common goal. And then I look at how they build these new coalitions, sort of strategies by stitching together a plurality of right-wing single-issue groups under the umbrella of the family. Chapter 3 really looks at the organizational development of the new right, and what is so striking is just how many organizations and institutions they created in such a short period of time. So between 1973 and 1976, a partial list includes the Committee for Survival of Free Congress, which was Weyrach's kind of main institution, the National Conservative Political Action Committee, Conservative Caucus, the Conservative Victory Fund, Committee for the Republic, Republican Study Committee, Senate Steering Committee, Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, Richard A. Viguerie Company, the Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, the American Conservative Union, and last but not least, the Heritage Foundation, which I will just make a total aside to note that Robert B. George resigned from the board of the Heritage Foundation today, which is interesting. And maybe we can talk about what's prompted that in the Q&A. And then Chapter 5 looks at how the Catholic and Protestant coalition took shape around the pro-family political platform. So you can see this little diagram shows kind of like a wagon wheel shape where all of these single issues are arrayed around the concept of pro-family politics. And really anything could be swept into this. Right to bear arms? Absolutely. A man needs to defend his property, which includes his wife and children. Pro-family politics. Anti-women's rights? Absolutely pro-family politics, because you don't want women getting uppity and having jobs and not raising their children in the home, right? Sort of everything could be grouped in under this empty signifier of pro-family. And for Weyrach, right, the family really was central not only for its political sort of instrumental uses, but also for religious reasons, right? So he said, well, first of all, from our point of view, this is really the most significant battle of the age-old conflict between good and evil, between the forces of God and forces against God that we've seen in our country. We see the anti-family movement as an attempt to prevent souls from reaching eternal salvation, and as such, we feel not just a political commitment to change this situation, but a moral, and if you will, a religious commitment to battle these forces. All right, so together, conservative Catholics and Protestants advanced a proactive politics that was, and I argue continues to be, dependent on three things: the construction of an imagined past, the manufacturing of an identity of victimhood, and the prefiguration of new social relations that are premised on the past and enacted in the present. And I'm going to take each of these step by step. So the first is constructing the past. And this is sort of begins with the idea that the Christian right formed in response and opposition to progressive gains that has been picked up on by scholars and by the movement itself, right? The Christian right very much promotes itself as backlash-driven. In the book, I focus on three of the sort of key backlash origin stories that the Christian right frequently deploys, and that is that it was responding to the Supreme Court striking down school prayer in public schools, the desegregation of schools, and the legalization of abortion. And I take each of these sort of one by one and really try and argue that these are not, that there is no backlash to these decisions that drives them, but rather a forward-looking and proactive agenda that predates any of these Supreme Court decisions. But the backlash narrative is really important. And the details kind of vary, but the general contours of it are always the same, right? There is some progressive issue, whether it's secularism, racial equality, abortion, gay rights, that catalyzes the mobilization of conservative Christians, and that the left is responsible for their action, right? So it is that the left articulates a radical agenda that demands the invention of new rights and necessarily entails the fundamental reorganization of society and the destruction of traditional practices, values, and rights that promotes and demands the right to act in response. As the true representatives and defenders of the nation, conservative Christians are then forced to take action against those who want to destroy white Christianity. And the real utility of backlash lies in its ability to obscure and deflect. I write in the book that on one hand, it can flatten history, masking ideological commitments and hiding institutional structures. On the other hand, it can be used to rhetorically shift the responsibility of right-wing activism onto the left. In these ways, backlash functions as a script that constructs and reconstructs a particular historical narrative and a related set of identities to shape our knowledge of both events and actors. And I want to be really clear that I don't pretend that there is no such thing as backlash, and I certainly don't pretend that history doesn't exist. Rather, what I'm interested in doing is getting us to think critically about the way in which we rhetorically frame backlash and allow the right to claim it as an explanation and justification for its actions that places the blame on those who are seeking recognition of their humanity, access to equal rights, and so on and so forth. I always feel like I need to give this little caveat because this is the one part of the book that people have gotten sort of saucy with me about. I had someone tell me that I personally offended her with it. And I was like, oh, okay, well, good to know. So I like to sort of justify myself a little bit more. All right. Now, related to the discourse of backlash is the cultivation of an ideology of victimhood. Because this discourse enables the Christian right to construct itself as victims of leftist aggression, we can then see the way in which an ideology or an identity of victimhood gets built. And I adapt this from Mitch Burbrier's work on the victim ideology of white supremacists and white separatists in the United States. And I find that we can sort of check through these little boxes and find that Christians are motivated by, right, these are sort of the criteria that Mitch Burbrier gives, that we can find that conservative Christians also see themselves or present themselves as being motivated by a desire to return to the status quo. They claim they are victims of aggression on the left, their religious and parental rights are violated, and they are shamed for defending their socially conservative religious beliefs. And if they fail to act defensively, Christian conservatives face an imminent and existential threat to their survival. When I interviewed the pastor of the Patriot Church, he said to me, well, we're going to be like the Jews. They're going to genocide us. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. Way to be offensive on multiple levels. Now, while the alleged perpetrators have changed over time, from secular humanists in the 1970s to cultural Marxists with Charlie Kirk, the victims have remained constant, right? White Christians, both Catholic and Protestant alike, are an oppressed and persecuted majority. And it really is in seeing themselves as common victims that the coalition becomes strengthened, right? Because they can see in one another, they sort of begin to form a collective identity. So in tandem, the discourse of backlash and the ideology of victimhood help obscure the radicality of the new Christian rights agenda by masking it as reactionary and defensive. And this gives rise to something I call prefigurative traditionalism. And here I really show my new school roots by borrowing from Carl Boggs, who wrote about workers' councils. And Boggs explained that by prefigurative, I mean the embodiment within the ongoing political practice of a movement of those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal. Right? So put plainly, prefiguration tries to bring about socio-political change by intentionally living as if the change has already occurred. We saw this with Occupy Wall Street. We saw it to some degree or another with Students for a Democratic Society. We see it with workers' councils, right? This idea that if you live out the society you want to create, you will manifest it. Now, on its face, conservatism runs counter to prefigurative politics, as it claims to look back to the traditional. So using that framework, we think of conservative movements as reactionary and progressive or leftist movements as generative and proactive. But I think this is wrong. And I think that what the right does, or in particular the Christian right, is to embody a set of social practices that are premised on what they claim are traditional hierarchies in social relations, but that more often than not have little relationship to history, right? So what they claim is the traditional one changes depending on who you're talking to. Sometimes it's the 1950s, sometimes it's 1910, sometimes it's 1860, sometimes it's 1787. But in each of these moments, if we actually look back at what conservative Christians were writing, or what Christians were writing, it was always a lament about the failure of society, right? The way in which people were failing to live godly lives, failing to perform their proper roles as husbands or wives or children. And so there is no moment that we can actually point to where we can say, well, conservative Christians are really happy at this time. This is the social world they want to recreate. Because at each of those moments, they are trying to move us towards something different than what they are experiencing in that time period. But this discourse of backlash that allows you to always say, well, we're just preserving the status quo, we're just trying to get back to the traditional, allows the traditional to be constructed and reconstructed at will. And then for policies to be introduced that will actually harness the coercive capacity of the state to force people to embody and act out those social relations with the hope of bringing about a transformed political and social world in the future. So the Catholic New Right proposed family policy that included reproductive health care, divorce law, and parenting programs. Social welfare policy that included welfare schemes to encourage two-parent, quote-unquote, traditional families. And economic policies that included opposing equal pay legislation and proposals to provide government stipends for women to remain out of the workforce. Many of the policies that the Catholic New Right was floating in the 1970s are articulated in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 plan for governance, right? Things like tax breaks for married families with children, and incentives to keep women really from working outside of the home and in the house to raise children. But we also see this now with things like MAHA, Make America Healthy Again's newest budget, which eliminates all funding for contraception and teen pregnancy prevention, and instead reinvests that funding in pronatalist policies, right? Support for IVF and other policies that will promote child raising. So by the end of the book, I gesture toward the way in which these sort of three things give us a set of prefigurative policies that really indicate that the new Christian right was, and I would say still is, motivated not by a desire to conserve the past, but rather by a desire to create a new political order. So despite making rights-based claims, the new Christian right did not aim to conserve an earlier iteration of the liberal democratic order. It is anti-liberal and it is anti-democratic. Rather, it sought and continues to seek to harness the state's coercive capacity to impose new forms of social relations and to institutionalize systems of dominance. There's much more to be said about what that state might look like. And I think that it's actually one of the possible areas of rupture in this coalition, that conservative Catholics have a different vision of the state than do conservative Protestants. Conservative Protestants are sort of envisioning a heritable democracy where cisgender white straight men of a certain age are still empowered to participate in political decision making. The conservative Catholics are much more authoritarian and theocratic in their aspirations and inclinations. And so that's a possible wedge area to explore. I will leave you once again with Paul Weyrich, attesting to the forward-looking and radical nature of his movement when he states, the old right considered itself a dying species. They tried to keep the flag flying while they saw the ships sink. In the new right, we trust in victory. We know that we represent the wave of the future. The old right had only one defensive strategy to retain the status quo. We don't accept the status quo. We want to change it. They did not carry the battle into the streets. We do.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that great presentation. First I want to thank Michael and the Institute for Public Knowledge for putting on this event. Thank you, Chelsea, for being the center of this whole event and this amazing book. And I'm honored to be part of it. I've known Chelsea since she was working on this as a dissertation years ago. You were modeling with me in June, I think. I was at the University of Oregon for many years, and so Chelsea came out as a new school student, and of course, as a new school grad myself, you know, have to take care of each other. But luckily, Chelsea's work at that point, and the tiger she had by the tail then, at the early stages of her dissertation, which became this book, was really quite extraordinary. And there's a lot to say about this book generally. As a work of American political development, it's exemplary. As a work of political science, it's better than exemplary, partly because the book takes institutions, social movements, and ideas seriously, and the relationship between them quite seriously, as opposed to either being an ideationally based account or a material or structural or institutional based account. It's a very lively account of how these things interact and what they mean. I think there are many things about the book that are quite surprising, and one of them, one of the obvious ones that is in the book's very title, is this relationship between Catholics and Protestants, which it is hard to go back retroactively and know how intense those divides were. I mean, going back to the Protestant Reformation, but my own father grew up as a Catholic in North Carolina and described getting beat up regularly as a kid for being Catholic in a largely Southern Baptist region. But this when Kennedy runs for president in 1960, one of the things he has to do is he gives his very famous speech saying that he has nothing to do, that he will serve the Constitution, not the Pope, and Americans need not be afraid that he is part of a papist conspiracy. And you fast forward to, say, someone like Mitt Romney making his a speech when he runs for president as a Republican in 2012. He makes a speech saying he's not going to serve the Mormon Church, but he's actually going to serve general Christian rights imperatives. There's not a separation of religion from the secular state. There is a certain kind of religious gesturing that is now not only okay but expected of this candidate. I think there's a part race plays a lot of. This story is racially saturated, but one of the things that's interesting is that Catholics were kind of a racialized group in a way. And across the 19th and 20th century, it's the Irish who were not quite white in the late 19th century, and then you had Southern and Eastern European Catholics as part of this great wave of immigration at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, whose ticket into a largely Northern European Protestant state meant that they were going to have to be careful about what their commitments were publicly. And so often you had segmented ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic communities, which people were mixing in the workplace more, but not really in social spheres. So the idea that Protestants would make common cause with Catholics in the 1970s is not a given. And I think one of the important things that Chelsea shows is that it's not a given at all. This is a moment of extraordinary creativity. And it's political creativity. These are entrepreneurs on both sides. And in this case, Paul Weyrich and Terry Falwell are these central figures. But everybody sees the possibility and the opportunity. But each side, particularly Protestants, are going to have to really change their orientation and make certain kinds of appeals within their own community to say, look, there's a possibility for a real movement here. And I think that is crucial. Richard Nixon did a lot to try to coax Catholics who were largely democratic throughout the 20th century into the Republican coalition, largely through Cold War rhetoric. These are people who still had family behind the Iron Curtain, but it was through questions of abortion, which, as you point out, was important. Catholics were not to Protestants in the same way at that point. So you see that this kind of the beginnings of how this is going to shift. But I think what Chelsea points out, which people, no one else has done in the literature I've read on the Christian right, or on the New Right generally, is to show really in both kind of a fine-grained empirical account, but also really an explanatory account of how this, how this weaving goes together. And I think the other amazing thing about this book is that if you write a book about, the mid-20th century, I wrote one of those too, and you're hoping when you write it that this will have some relevance to, to the contemporary world, particularly politics. Chelsea's book couldn't be more relevant to this moment. The ways in which, and there's a last chapter of this book. You all should buy this book, by the way. You can read it right away. But the last part of it demonstrates how the Christian right used liberal discourse, liberal rights discourse, and liberal pluralism, and liberal democratic institutions to advance an agenda which really, at this point, has become all but entirely authoritarian and anti-democratic. And Chelsea kind of shows that it was not true then, but the roots of it and some of the logic of it is there, and it's played out. And we see J.D. Vance here on the on the screen. Because I always think, I grew up a Catholic, so I don't offend anybody, but when I meet someone who's converted to Catholicism, I'm always like, what's going on? Even if it's not quite political, there's always something about, it's not just about liturgy, there's something about hierarchy and authority that really is the draw there, I think. When people become Pentecostals or evangelicals or go in this direction, it might be an ecstatic experience, or there might be a broad communitarian experience, or there might be something affective in this, and even democratic in the call. For Catholics, it's like the opposite, I think. And so, what's that? Well, which is not to say that there are Catholic movements that have long been left-wing, right? The Catholic Worker was based, Dorothy Day was based right here in New York. Liberation theology, as we know, was an important movement across Latin America and here in the U.S. But that doesn't. But I think what this book shows is that. Tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it's as if there are Catholic intellectual ideas, conservative Catholic intellectual ideas, with a certain kind of evangelical populism or hierarchical democracy, which is really what kind of pulls this thing together and makes it work. So it's not Catholicism as such, it's Catholicism, it's conservative Catholicism, which itself has kind of changed over time, right? It's become something else, which might explain why Robbie George has recently left Heritage. Anyway, there's so much more to say about the book itself, but I have a couple questions, and these aren't critical questions. I love this book so much, I just have to tell you. But this question of this is partly back to the question about Dorothy Day. There have been progressive or left-leaning Christian movements across American history, right? It was a democratizing force in the early 19th century, late 18th century. It was the driving force behind abolition. It was the social gospel movement was infected populism everywhere. And so, as the historian Edward Larson, I guess, wrote this really great account of the Scopes monkey trial. It makes the argument that what you normally see as the inherent win story is progress against the reactionary, irrational forces of religion, creationism. And he said, but partly what's going on there is you've got look at one of the characters involved, William Jennings Bryan, who represents creationism there. Bryan is not just hostile to science, he's hostile to social Darwinism, he's hostile to eugenics, he knows how much of it, he's hostile to laissez-faire capitalism, and he knows that this is bad news for workers in a way. And so partly what's being defended there is not, post-war liberalism is always been like one long version of, in this house we believe in science and, right, whatever. But that was actually a very different thing. Like in this house we don't believe in science, but we do believe in workers and egalitarianism. So these things can be put together in different ways. And so here the book kind of begins with a story where you have fundamentalists who are culturally conservative and they have not been able to articulate this politically yet. They are able to, at a certain moment, there's a political creative moment where this really clicks in here in the late 70s. But why would we not have seen a left-wing version of this? What is it, since it's not actually a backlash to an earlier time, literally, it's a forward-looking vision, how does it become a left-wing version?
So I would say that there is, right, you sort of give this great history and brief around how we come about that progressive Christianity. But in each of those moments, Christianity is also always used for conservatives, right? And so, when I teach my students about abolition, we Christian defense of slavery, because that was as much a part of that moment as were anti-slavery abolitionists who were using their faith. So the faith has always been sort of open and available to competing interpretations. Now, Kevin Cruz, right, One Nation Under God, makes the case that it's really post-Depression era politics where capitalism fuses with Christianity in this particular way. That sets it on the path of being conservative. I think there's something to be said for that. I think there's also something to be said for, like, Angela Lair's argument that it is fears of nuclear annihilation, right? And the sort of like existential and imminent destruction during the Cold War that also drives people more toward conservative politics. But I think more broadly, just the Cold War is inescapable, right? Because it is godless communism against godful capitalism. And that those sort of battle lines get drawn. And then Christians who are trying to articulate a leftist or progressive vision become tarred with the same brush as communists, right? And we all know how in American politics we regard socialism and communism, right? So I think that's where the story gets sort of set in stone, right? That you can't break apart that sort of ideological divide and the way in which God becomes the provenance of capitalism and godlessness becomes the provenance of socialism.
Yeah, so it's locked in. That makes a lot of sense. Another question I had has to do with, it's a white story, right? And this is sort of, because it's actually right up against a black church-based civil rights movement, in reaction to that. And a lot of the anti-busing stuff is tied into this and other Southern segregationist politics. I wonder, though, if you go to a Turning Point event today, you will see lots of black and Latino evangelicals and Catholics, for that matter. There are Catholic far-right traditions around the world, which people bring to the United States and articulate them now through American conservative and right-wing institutions. Do you think that there's something here? Does the story you tell here, which is more racially anchored in that era, is it flexible enough? There's a flexibility with Catholics and Protestants in that moment. Is there a flexibility now that this helps create the possibilities? Does a Christian right now, say Christian nationalism, create greater possibilities for a multiracial right?
I think so. I think, and this is somewhere, if anyone is, casting around for a dissertation project, there's actually a really beautiful data looking at perceptions and attitudes toward Catholics from Protestant Christian nationalists, and just got to repeal the 14th Amendment. And I had just taken a sip of coffee, and I was like, oh, okay. I'm going to just swallow this and take a beat and process what you just said to me. Right, so I think that there are still, Fuentes, right? So Robbie P. George resigned from the Heritage Foundation today because of the president of the Heritage Foundation's support for Tucker Carlson platforming Nick Fuentes, who is a self-avowed fascist, right? Anti-Semite, Holocaust denialist. For a while he was calling himself a Francoist. Nick Fuentes has confusing ideas about many things. He thinks that having sex with women makes you gay because women are so reprehensible that a real man wouldn't be attractive. I mean, it breaks my brain. But right, so you have these like staunchly white supremacist, anti-Semitic contingents, and then you have something like the and here I do want to actually defend the Patriot Church, that they're not in that game, right? That the arguments around repealing the 14th Amendment are always sort of caveated with, but we don't want racial discrimination. They want discrimination against gay people, they want discrimination against religious minorities, they want discrimination against women, but not racial discrimination. And so it's complicated and it's messy, but I think there is certainly an opportunity. And here I'm really going to go outside my comfort zone, but I'm going to say, like, you can look at the movement and travel of Christian right activists to places like Uganda, right, to promote and support anti-gay legislation that really signals not just a possibility, but an invitation to coalition. And similarly, at the United Nations, right, Christian right activists from the United States have often found themselves joining forces with conservative Muslim representatives to oppose women's rights initiatives and to oppose gay rights initiatives. So there's room for lots of different things to happen. I think, though, again, that these are potential wedge issues to break apart the coalition, right? Because there are these avowed white supremacists in the movement who really have large platforms. And so how long can you sustain a multiracial right? I don't know. I mean, certainly the election a couple of weeks ago indicates that Latinx voters are not along for the ride in a maybe durable or stable way. But that could just be because Trump has gone about things in such a ham-fisted way, and someone who would have been more sophisticated or subtle could have retained that coalition a little bit longer. I don't know. You're the expert here, so I want to hear what you have to say about this.
I don't know, but I think your point also raises with the Fuentes stuff a real fissure, which is anti-Semitism on the right. Now, really, it's bared its teeth in a way that was for so long not the case since the late 1960s was not. It didn't really have much place in it. And famously, William F. Buckley asked to denounce Pat Buchanan for his anti-Semitism, and Joe Sobering and other people in his camp. Buchanan was another. Buchanan's father was a strong Francoist. He was a Catholic conservative lover of Spain that era. But so it does seem like that old forms of Christian, both Protestant and Catholic forms of anti-Semitism seem to be, with the new strength of Christian nationalism, suddenly seems to, Tucker Carlson, they're just not afraid to say it, right? Charlie Kirk played this kind of weird role, kind of trying to split the difference and keep people in on this, and he was a very powerful figure who had to continually face Fuentes gropers, at events, and then satisfy pro-Israel donors. But after Kirk was shot, I think suddenly it was like the floodgates opened up in ways that we are now, it's churning, right? And it's gonna, we're going to see at the Turning Point National Conference soon what this looks like. We're seeing what it looks like in D.C. and we're seeing how some other Christian Catholics or Catholic conservatives are starting to back away from this. So anyway, I think it's so dynamic and in flux right now that I'm not sure what to say about this, but it does seem like your account is a living account of political creativity in the way these things kind of come together, which also means it's also to be an account of how these things come apart, historically determined by. But the other thing, you mentioned this, and I had been kind of wondering when I read the book, because I kept thinking about contemporary eras and reading and so on. It's kind of impressive, but nevertheless, this international circuitry now. So Viktor Orban's parental rights stuff and anti-trans stuff now gets discussed in the Tennessee legislature, right? And you have this kind of this stuff going around in ways that you have an international on the right instead of on the left. You have a Christian nationalism, internationalism, which seem to really get a lot of juice, intellectual juice as well as social movement juice from different. As you said, there are Hindu nationalism and forms of Muslim fundamentalism are in there, but really these very Christian forms of it seem to be like directly through NACON conferences or CPAC really come right to the center. And so your account is a very American account, but how do you, when you look across the global stage right now and think about this, how do you?
I think, so I mean, one of the things that was really interesting was as I was working on the dissertation, one of my grad school colleagues at the new school was writing a dissertation on fascism in South and Central America. And he texted me from the archives in Argentina, and he said, "Your man is in my archives." And I was like, "Paul? He's there?" And sure enough, right, Paul Weyrich had his fingers in the dirty war and had sort of been providing some suggestions and, sort of was an interested observer, not quite a participant, but, and I think that has been the case for at least 50 years, right? That you have had these sort of international, especially Christian right networks, but everything changes with the advent of new technology. And that's part of the story in the book is also, right, new technologies are part of what enables and facilitates this coalition. And now we have, a whole new world we're dealing with, where it's not just that we have the internet or we have texting, but we have things like Telegram, and now we have deepfakes, and we have, right, like it goes on and on and on. And the sort of like hyper-nationalist, internationalist right is perplexing. But there's a lot of folks have been doing really great work showing, right, the way in which these intellectual networks are being built. I mean, it like is a dagger through my heart every time I read that they hold in common Gramsci because they've like somehow adopted Gramsci as their own. But yeah, so I think it's happening, right? And at the same time, you look at, some of the schisms that also particularly characterize Eastern European Christianity. And you think, how are they doing this? And I think the very American story I tell about brokering the coalition around this shared identity of victimhood, around fears of an existential and imminent threat, these are threads that continue to be present. And so they help us understand how they are managing to maintain hyper-nationalist politics that are nonetheless international in their influences and coalitions.
Yeah. I think it's one of the great things about the book is the idea that the concept of backlash is what does the work, not actual backlash. That you can gesture back towards a manufactured tradition or a past to authorize a very radical vision of something that has never existed. And you see it again. I was thinking in your book, this is kind of an aside, but this idea about new platforms and new ways of reaching people. Richard Vickery started, he kind of cut his teeth in George Wallace's national campaigns in '68. One of the things he did is he found possible Wallace volunteers by getting hold of mailing lists that showed people who would send away for Hank Williams records, and people who had like strong local church membership. And it was like those are the people who bought Hank Williams records and our local church members are going to be the ones who are going to will not just be voters for Wallace, but will canvass for Wallace. And was able to sort of build up this thing.
I didn't know that story.
There he is as a central character.
Yeah. One of the sadder things I found in the archives was a letter to Jerry Falwell from a woman who thought that his fundraising appeals had been personal. Because, right, you just have this new technology emerging that allows for mass printing of text that looks like handwriting and can be personalized with a name. And there was just this heartbreaking letter from a woman who was like, I thought you were asking me personally, and you weren't, and I gave you all my money. Just like elder abuse, right? Yeah, but the technology is an important part of this story, I think.
Yes, yeah. So why don't we, should we open up to,
Start the Q&A. Take questions in the room, but also on Zoom too. Some people on Zoom. But let's start in the room first. Two gentlemen up front.
Thanks, great stuff. You mentioned Heritage Foundation, and you're kind of tracing the intellectual ideas and applications together. You should also follow the money. So can you make a comment on who are the big financial backers?
Oh, sure. I mean, at the time, it was Coors, right? And the Coors Family Foundation is what poured the money in to start the Heritage Foundation. I would actually say, so Alex DeBranco did a lot of work while writing their dissertation, looking at differences in how people affiliated with the new right give money, as opposed to on the left. Right? And it turns out that the right is so disciplined about giving its money to think tanks and to promoting these institutions and building these organizations.
Is it just Horst Family and Stately and Bradley and the visual players, or?
I mean, that's what I found, right? I didn't come across anyone who struck me as like, wait, who are you? Why haven't I heard of you before? But it really, I wasn't paying a ton of attention to where the money was coming from beyond the direct mail, because so much of what we were doing, right? And it really, they sort of capitalize on campaign finance reform in 73 and 74 in order to begin to create PACs and to solicit smaller donations so they're less reliant on big donors. So while they have some of these big donors in the background, really all of these organizations and these single issue groups are able to solicit small ticket donations from their constituents.
Like Moms for Liberty, example?
Well, sure. I mean, Moms for Liberty does this perfectly, right? But also, there's all these organizations that are fronts for the Koch brothers that are hard to identify, right? Because they seem to be independent, small PACs that are doing what they were doing in the 1970s, and they actually aren't. So now, I think, with the kind of proliferation of dark money and 527s, like it gets much murkier to try and figure out who is actually funding things, and to be able to make the case when an organization is really funded by independent donations as opposed to.
Do you think it is mainly mega donors, or is it a small donors?
then or now?
Now,
Now, I mean, my hunch would be it's the big donors, but that's just a hunch.
partnerships.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, after Citizens United, it was like a firehouse of cash from support for the way that it dwarfs individual contributions. For most 501c4s and
yeah. There's-
Oh, sorry.
I just would also say that, I mean, in our current moment, it's sort of like all also have no idea what to make of a Republican president taking over ownership stakes in private corporations, right? Like, all the rules are sort of suspended in this moment. And it really seems, I would say, more like there's sort of extortion of donors happening from the White House, which, yeah, I like, everything's in flux at the
Even
moment.
the evangelical movement is sort of drifting to it. I think, I mean, some people may be from the perspective, it's businessful.
I mean, for some of the mega churches, certainly. But I think that one of the things that I try and do in the book is really take seriously for the grassroots that these are genuine beliefs people have. And that extends to Wyrick and Marshall. I mean, they really were truly driven by their Catholic faith. It was never a put on, which is important to sort of recognize that at least they were very consistent, coherent in their thinking.
I think it's astonishing you mentioned economic and social inequalities, the motivation for this. You know, you mentioned the late 70s period, the beginning of the Christian right. That's when the war babies who were the children of people who benefited from the GI Bill. That's the means educated war babies were emerging as professionals. And I remember the master's degree people out of working with, they're laughing at the southern rural people who cared more about how the kid was doing on the local basketball team than how the kid was doing academically. And that's when the economic inequality began to really crash. And you know, it's exploding today with people like Trump and Wyrick and all these other people. It's not educated people that are supporting these people. It's all the people who barely got through high school and who were, you know, manual laborers and farmers and all that. The people who were in Charlottesville who said the Jews will not replace us. They had a real argument. They had a real complaint. And everybody just called them anti-Semites. But they weren't. They were saying that the Jews who they see as the people who run industry, these people were so technologizing everything that they were being pushed out of, you know, out of work, out of their lives. And they were complaining about that, and nobody paid any attention to it.
I would still call that rank anti-Semitism, even if there is an economic.
But even the economic things is not, there's no, you know, you can be middle class or upper middle class and still imagine yourself to be an economic victim or a social victim or a victim of the Jews, right? It doesn't, you don't have to be working class or economically disadvantaged to.
Which is more likely to be working class, isn't it?
Not, I mean, again, you see Christian egalitarian movements which go in different directions, made up of workers and farmers. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be, you know, William F. Buckley, you know, grows up as a child of royal wealth, right? He tells, in his memoir, he tells a story about anti-Semitic pranks he and his siblings would carry on his children. You know, and the anti-Semitism among the wealthiest Americans, among the Brahmin class, has always been extraordinarily acute. You know, and so I think that those you can find them across the spectrum. I do think, though, you were right that right-wing populism in the 1970s, which fed a lot of these streams, which was also the basis of the Wallace campaigns and the basis of other really of the Reagan's 76 campaign as well as 1980 was of an articulation of economic grievance in a right-wing form. But I don't think it necessarily has to go in that direction.
I think one question to you, Jim. So, question.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to looking at your book. Let me push back a little bit on this issue of the backlash. I would argue that the backlash that we saw in the 60s was going on since the New Deal among the right, and then the Great Society was backlashed in real time with consequences in the 1966 congressional election, the 68 presidential election, and the 1972 presidential election. And so to, I guess, equate it as a narrative, I think I have to push back on that. That's a little bit too simplistic. The backlash was also incorporating religious issues. Now, earlier the commentator asked an interesting question about why did the left not develop a theological response to all this. They did. It just was, it didn't have any gravitas the same way that the ultra-right's embrace of fundamentalist Christianity and the alliance you accurately point out with Catholicism did. I remember very vividly the civil rights movement was part of that, the anti-war movement was part of that, and myself in situations where I was arguing in a broadcasting institution, well, what about the conservative right and the way they're handling religion? Shouldn't we deal with this? And people consciously would not want to deal with that. So I found that very amusing, and that was in the 1980s. I was constantly arguing that we have to deal with these guys because look at how politically powerful they're becoming. Now, how do you see one keep the situation right now? Because it looks to me, and the other question that came up in listening to what you're saying is, let's look at Auf Deutschland. Auf Deutschland has direct ties. If we're talking about backlashes, we're talking about direct ties in that movement to Nazism coming right out of World War II. And in the case of Thuringia, the whole political leadership there have direct ties to Nazi ideologues. And so there's no issue of a backlash, there's no issue. It's straight up a stream of neo-Nazism coming in. And Bannon himself has openly talked about a common term of the far right around the world. He consciously used that term. So how do we deal with this right now with Chelsea? How do we fight against this?
I mean, that's such a small question you're asking. So I will just reiterate that I don't make a case that backlash isn't a real phenomenon. I make a case about how the narrative of backlash gets used. So I just want to be clear, right? I'm not ahistorical. I'm not. That's
sort of a cop-out because I heard you very clearly earlier. But go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
I mean, you should read the book, and then we can talk about how I write about the discourses of backlash as they apply to abortion and school desegregation and school prayer. Because I'm not making, I think you're attributing to me a much more sweeping argument than what I actually make in the book. So I would love to continue that part of the conversation.
You said, okay. I'll look.
But how we fix this? I mean, I have no idea how we fix this. I do think that the new right lays out a really clear-cut plan of action that took 50 years to come fully to fruition. But it begins with running for local office. It begins with taking over the state party leadership for the Republican Party. It begins with creating sort of overlapping but mutually supportive organizations and fundraising. And we could follow that program of action. It would take a long time. But I think it is possible. I mean, you look at the judiciary right now, and it is the sort of culmination of 50 years of strategizing around producing legal thinkers and practitioners who will advance a particular interpretation of the law and the Constitution, and then creating organizations to support their ascendancy, electing presidents to nominate them, and senators to confirm them.
But some it goes back to the whole world issue and the power memo, where the conservative people started to really do their homework, started really raising money. They became, they figured out how to use technology and computers long before the left ever did. And they became more sophisticated. Their campaigns are more sophisticated.
I mean, I think the right is better at politics than the left in this country.
Yes,
Absolutely. I think the right does it better. I think that the idea that the right is reactionary and backlash driven has led the left to believe that it is 2 steps ahead. And it's just not. And so that is part of my investment in getting us to think critically about the narrative of backlash, is that it really says that the right is motivated by the left. And I just don't think it is, right? There are other visions, other worlds that are being created. But I think we could take a page out of what the right does to learn how to, I don't know, fight better, fight stronger.
And it's like politically, right? As investing their money.
Yeah.
You know, the tons of millions of dollars, I mean, that didn't come from nowhere.
I want to make sure we have enough time, since we have 15 minutes left to address the questions in the room. We'll take 2 questions at a time, so in the back, and in the back.
Hi, thank you for coming. I've been reading the book while I've been writing or trying to get an idea for my other master's here at NYU. So I'm trying to tackle the idea of the globalization of hate, especially with Gen Z and the idea that Nick Fuentes' video can now go further than a speech from the radio in the 70s. It can reach areas of the world that hate can be changed and altered in ways. I guess what I was thinking while we were having these conversations was, we see the veil of religion kind of put on themes like anti-Semitism, racism, anti-women's rights movements and stuff like that. And we're seeing really quickly, places like the UK, it slaps sometimes the religious veil on some of these movements. And I was wondering what your guys' thoughts on this new age of hate going from one place to another, and that a Nick Fuentes video, for example, can be found on a little boy's phone in Germany, and in France, and in Japan, and in the US. Where is that taking the conversation?
We have a question.
Yeah, I just want to know more about, like, considering your research that you've done on male supremacy, like, how does that differ from this kind of alt-right religious conservatism, and how are they similar, how are they different, and kind of just like, which one do you think is a bigger issue right now?
I don't, these questions I think are speaking to each other in some way. So on the globalization of hate, my answer was going to be, we'll look at something like the manosphere, right, where you have this international online network where ideas are being transmitted rapidly, and it's, you know, we can talk about Nick Fuentes, but we could also talk about Andrew Tate as someone who, right, has global reach, and I think that it is, you know, in some ways we still need to account for the way in which many of these movements are hyper-nationalist, are motivated by nationalist concerns, even as they are adopting and integrating ideas and strategies from elsewhere. I think certainly for the male supremacist kind of network, you can see movement, but in both literal and figurative translation, there's transformation that occurs as well, as things are slotted into their particular sort of social set of relations and political relations. A few years ago, I had a student who wrote his undergraduate honors thesis on the movement of male supremacist kind of terminology and ideas from the English-speaking manosphere to the Philippines. And he was able to find elements of male supremacist discourse represented in the Philippines. He is brilliant. I need to give him a shout out. He's now doing his PhD at UC Santa Cruz. But so I think, right, you can find these networks and you can trace them. Someone like Meredith Pruden has done really amazing work on visually mapping the manosphere, and to see how these networks, how we can sort of, right, visually geographically map them, as well as map them in terms of nodal
as in like they're taking advantage of this rising incel male confidence issue that Gen Z is going through right now, and they're kind of plotting what they can say, what they can do. I mean, make friends that say, for example, why have sex with women? It kind of amplifies, he's kind of trying to appeal to low confidence young men and make this following. Do you or am I insane?
No, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, but it is, these worlds are so complex, right? There's like the golden boy who's doing his online thing, and then there's Nick Fuentes, and then there's Andrew Tate, right? And each of them are representing a particular sort of area in social media. There was just a convening at Penn State called Birthing the Nation, and one of the themes that kept coming out is just how much more successful the right has been at dominating discursive spaces, right? And so there is a proliferation of different ideologies and attitudes and identities in these spaces, but across the board, they're dominated by right-wing voices.
And yet they say they're victims by mainstream media.
Of course. I mean, this is, right, like that ideology of victimhood is really, really deep. And then to sort of pivot to your question, so within the Christian right, patriarchal traditionalism is the form that male supremacy takes most of the time. And I think one of the things at IRMS, the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, that we try and be really clear on is that we don't think of male supremacism as a gateway to the right. It is its own set of ideologies that exists on the right, but also can be found on the left. I spent plenty of time in grad school around anarcho-misogynist leftist men, so we can attest to its prevalence on the left. But right on the right, male supremacism is its own sort of set of ideologies. But then when we look at the Venn diagram with the Christian right, you know, patriarchal traditionalism brings them into conversation with one another. And then we can add white supremacism, and we want to see overlap in there too. And then we can add anti-Semitism. And so each of these movements is really sort of building on these points of nodal connection to like really be unfair to leftist political thought. I'm going to say that like the right is doing a better job of hegemony and socialist strategy than the left has maybe ever, right? Of sort of finding ways of drawing connections between these nodal points. And male supremacy is both its own set of ideas and also is prevalent in the Christian right.
And they have even blamed the left for that as well. The left has been supremacist. The left can be consider themselves better educated and more articulate people and knowledgeable. You know, they look down their noses at
I mean, I think this is one of these things where, and we had a big conversation about this at the Penn State convening around how we want to define our terms, right? And for me, if you're going to ascribe something as being leftist, it needs to be committed to egalitarianism, and it needs to be committed to some form of non-hierarchical social, economic, and political structure. So certainly within the left, you will find people who I think articulate supremacist ideas. I mean, you will find people who are racist, you will find people who are misogynist, you will find people who are classist and elitist in all kinds of ways. Whether or not they are reflecting leftist values when they express those beliefs or positions, I think is open to conversation. But you know, there are, forgive my language, but there are assholes everywhere.
This is fantastic discussion.
I mean, there's multiple books about the lack of coalition on the left that we can talk about some other time. All right, we got a lot of questions. We'll take Hannah's question first, and then Devin.
Thank you so much. This is great. A lovely presentation, a lovely discussion. I was really interested to hear about that seminal moment of coming together between Catholics and Protestants. I mean, and I like when you talk about the tensions between them. It strikes me that the Catholics are the junior when that happens, post 2016, or do you see earlier shifts in the dynamics, or is my understanding of the hierarchy between them misguided?
Question.
Yeah, I think it's a related question too, yeah. So I grew up in a family that held these, my dad went to Francis Schaeffer's place when we were in Switzerland in the 70s or whatever, so I grew up in a very conservative household. It was very political, but it was a big hero. And what has always struck me about my parents' political commitments is how, in these timelines that we're talking about, is just how sustained this is over time. And so I think what I'm curious about is, there's this, I think, bringing in this strong role of religion kind of gives me, an idea that there's this kind of long-term hope. My parents have this that is driving that, and we can see beyond the horizon. And I don't really see that on the left, and I'm not looking for like a liberal Protestant version of that but who do you see articulating some sort of vision that transcends the individual that might animate the hope to acquire for a movement to have that everlasting power on the left?
Okay, I'm going to give you a serious answer in a second, but just off the cuff, I'm going to say, right, this is why Mom Dottie won, and this is why he won with so much of the vote, is because he is articulating a positive vision for the future that is not just one of grievance or countering what the right is doing. It's actually proactive. So that's my very short answer. Going back to this question, so Catholics, at least in this particular moment, they are the sort of intellectual scaffolding. They provide the intellectual and the strategic scaffolding, and the Protestants turn out the voters. Now, over the course of this coalition, I would make a case that Protestants have been Catholicized and Catholics have been Protestantized. So the research I'm doing right now is on looking at covenant communities, which are these sort of this charismatic Catholic movement to create communities that are governed by a covenant. They're as creepy as they sound, but they're fascinating, right? And these begin to emerge in the late 1960s, early 1970s, really as Catholics are taking in aspects of evangelicalism, of kind of Protestant culture. And the Protestants really, I think, take on a lot of the intellectual arguments promoted by the Catholics, right? So now we see opposition to abortion. We see really a movement toward birth control. There is wild stuff happening amongst like youth social media. If you're on TikTok, of young women being told not to take birth control, that it will destroy their health and their bodies. And we can draw a line, right, from Catholic religious tenets around contraception and birth control to these kind of influencers on TikTok. So we see kind of the migration of some of the intellectual religious argumentation from the Catholics into the mainstream Protestants. And the very fact that like Protestants are now considering not supporting IVF is wild, right? Like it is such a recent kind of line that we can draw from the Catholic position to kind of mainstream Protestant attitudes. Protestants have been trying to catch up, right? Building their own institutions for higher education, things like that. Patrick Henry College, there's, but the Catholics have it. What was that? Hillsdale. But the Catholics kind of have it on lock, and that is why when you look at the Supreme Court, we have what, 6 Catholic justices, right? And they have most of them come up through Catholic education, at least to some degree or another. So yeah.
That's the natural law that you're starting.
Yes. Which again, I mean, I will say that when I started all of this, Robbie George's natural law theology terrified me, and now we have Adrian Vermeule, who is a wild ride the last 15 years.
Last two questions. Go ahead, here. Yes.
Yeah, George, with this recent, I don't know what to call it, the Catholic bishops put out this how we should treat immigrants and foreigners, and the Pope seems to be in line with that. And, obviously J.D. Vance and the right, the Catholic right, is using the magazine on how to treat foreigners and immigrants and all that. How do you think that will affect the coalition between, because that hierarchical Catholic thing, either there's going to be another split in the church and the Protestant, right and liberal. It appears that the Catholic Church, at least its popes recently, are not leaning towards the right as much as they were Paul. So, just your thoughts on that.
And then the last question.
I just keep thinking about the last time we had like a Christian, and first of all, I hate that we're having this conversation at all, because it's mind-boggling to me. It's a fact of life that Christianity is such a fundamental part of our politics. But that gives me the creeps that we're in this, because it just doesn't really feel like that's what we should be in the end doing. But I keep thinking about Reagan and Carter. Now, Carter was this president who was, if I ever had an imagination of what a Christian fellow should be, he was that guy. He really was. He was to the last breath, full of decency. And Reagan represented something entirely different and captured the imagination of the American people in a way that Carter couldn't intend. Reagan was this mythological character. He's false. He was a billboard. He was an actor. And we have been set that on the day. And that, I think, was a turning for us. And I don't know if there's a question built into that, but it seems like if we ever had an opportunity to sort of step in behind, like, if a Christian was really there to lead us, he would have been that guy, and we would have fallen in. I think this is all money, it's all business, and it's all
Just quickly on that, even Carter, though, was chosen as a compromise Democratic candidate because he was a Southern evangelical and because he was a moderate. He wasn't a liberal. He's one that opens the door to deregulation of doors to liberalism. So in a way, by the time you get to the choice of being Carter and Reagan, the entire spectrum of the right word, Carter had to be
Question two, it was up for so long.
Yeah, it's your thought, and I was just wondering if it's something you said with your presentation about the points where traditions and individualization of the state of and you mentioned that there's a psychological phenomenon of free body culture. So I was just wondering if you could say something about this and what this looks like in terms of policy and hopefully
All right. To the Carter point, I just said Carter was such a lovely and terrible president. And one of the questions that I get asked all the time by students is about, but how Trump, right? How can religious believers support Trump? And the argument is, they've sort of fashioned him as King Cyrus, and so he is a sort of arm of God's will, and he himself does not have to be godly. And I think if what you are looking to do is fundamentally, radically transform our political institutions and the structure of the state, what you need is someone who has no fidelity to the Constitution, has no real deep political, ideological commitments, but is willing to be used in various ways. I think that gets a little bit to your question about sort of thinking about ruptures. So the Catholics and where they are going, we just finished writing an article in the spring about how conservative Catholics really, with Buckley at the sort of forefront, have consistently articulated and staked out a position where they can refuse sort of claiming the mantle of traditionalism or orthodoxy while also resisting instruction that one disagrees with. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. So the question is like, will there be a schism within the Catholic Church from the right in the United States? And I don't think so, because they're so comfortable with just saying, well, not this pope. Well, not what this pope says. And they've been doing it for 75 years. And
That's
so I
the
think
cafeteria Catholic.
it is the cafeteria Catholic. It is, you know, the sort of J.D. Vance, right? Who Francis, I mean, you have to love Francis for actually saying, like, he misunderstands the faith. And then he died. But I think that there's, right, I don't see them, as much as they may saber rattle around schism, I don't see them actually doing it anytime soon.
But they'll form hard right factions ever since Vatican II, right? And like these groups like Opus Dei and New Belonging because there's this
Yeah.
fascist Catholic.
And who are continuing to sort of jockey for supremacy within the church, right? And I think certainly they don't want to actually break away, because if they did so, they would lose the power structure of, you know, the Roman Catholic Church, the money, the land, the fancy outfits, all of it. But so on the point of potential ruptures, I think the coalition that I write about exists as they are dreaming, right? As they are working toward a common end that is not clearly defined or articulated, because it is just a little kernel of hope, right? And where we are right now, I think surpasses Weyrich's wildest dreams. I don't think we ever could have imagined getting as far or as close to transforming the state as we are. And so there is a possibility that when it really comes to actually implementing all of this, it all breaks down, because they maybe don't agree as much as we think they do, and they maybe don't agree as much as they think they do.
I mean, once the people get a real taste of it.
Well, I mean, there's what the rest of us might
That's
do.
right.
But even for them, I think there are these big sort of divisions around what they envision the future looking like. Patrick Deneen wants little communitarian city-states. I don't know, Peter Thiel also wants communitarian capitalist city-states. Can you make those two work together? I really think so. Because one is, you know, sort of theocratic, and the other is...
Oh, he talked about the Antichrist.
There's so much there. Okay, we're going to stop. Once the Antichrist enters the realm, we're done.
Chelsea, Joe, thank you very much. Thank you.